You can probably define a horror game or a puzzle game, but what is a thriller game? Your first instinct might be to think of the movie genre, one best preceded by the word erotic. You might not think of Alan Wake. It's usually classified as action-adventure, whatever that means. In fact, the only person I've ever seen refer to Alan Wake as a thriller is Sam Lake, the lead writer of Alan Wake. And what does that guy even know? I didn't play Alan Wake for the longest time because when I asked people if it was a horror game, they'd say, no, not really. Having now played it, I disagree. There's the battle of light and dark, an isolated, foggy, rural town, possessed people, shadow monsters. It's even set in the Pacific Northwest, which is widely recognized as America's spookiest biome. The gameplay is also structured like a horror game. Wake doesn't really level up. He stumbles if you jump from too high a height, and he desperately needs coffee to make it through the day. That all makes him relatable, but it sets him apart from your typical action game hero. All of this places Alan Wake pretty firmly in the survival horror genre. So why did Sam Lake insist on calling Alan Wake a thriller when that isn't a game genre and doesn't mean anything? And what does it matter if people call Alan Wake a thriller or a horror or an action game? You might not think genres are all that important, but they're actually one of the most basic ways that people make choices about what media to engage with and how they're going to engage with it. And if you don't think genre can affect what you think of a piece of media, consider the turnabout on a little movie called Starship Troopers. It was released to terrible reviews and poor box office showings because audiences perceived it as a dumb action movie with fascist overtones. Only after a critical reevaluation did people come around on the idea that, oh, it's satire. Your experience watching Starship Troopers for the first time is going to be very different if it is introduced to you as an action movie versus a satire. One of those genre markers sets you up to perceive a pro-fascist science fiction romp. The other frames the movie as critical of the fascist elements it depicts, basically the exact opposite movie. Establishing audience expectations of a piece of media is just one of the many ways that we use genres. If you're a creator, understanding the genre you're working in can guide the choices you make about characters, writing styles, endings. If you're writing a comedy of errors romance, you know that you're working towards a happy ending. When I write a non-fiction video essay, I know that I should generally start with a question, end with an answer, and not write any sentences that are super long because I'm going to have to record it all on screen, and if I fuck up really late in that sentence, then I'm going to have to do another take of it. So it's possible that Lake described Alan Wake as a thriller because that's what inspired him, and that's the framework he used to write it. And in that case, the fact that there's no video game equivalent to psychological thriller doesn't really matter. As an audience member, the genre is probably the first piece of information you're going to learn about a new piece of media. And the moment you hear that it's a Western, a detective story, or a romantic comedy, you're going to start making assumptions about what it looks like, the structure of the story, and whether or not you're going to watch it, even if you know literally nothing else about it. In the oversaturated media market we live in, those assumptions are vital for focusing on media that you're predisposed to enjoy. You'll save yourself a lot of time. And in that context, calling Alan Wake a thriller is really confusing. It's a bad marketing strategy because that's not an extant genre in video games. There's no touchstone for consumers to compare it to. All it really did was muddy the waters so that when you ask people if Alan Wake is a horror, they'll say, no, not really. It is! It is! Genres are fundamentally just a way to categorize media, to put a game or movie or whatever into conversation with other similar texts. Calling Starship Troopers an action movie only aligns it with other action movies, whereas calling it a satire aligns it with other satires and with action movies. And the opposite is true. Genres can be used to create distance from other texts that say the creator doesn't want to be associated with. And I think that's what's happening with Alan Wake. When asked how Alan Wake compares to other survival horror games, Lake says that for video games and horror, everybody thinks about blood and gore and big monsters coming at you. And that's definitely not what Alan Wake is about. It's kind of stylized, building atmosphere and mood, and at the same time, it is an action game. Horror games aren't atmospheric. Horror games have the highest gross national vibes of any genre. In an interview with Keith Stewart conducted for The Guardian, Lake says, "In games, We have not really seen a small town as it is portrayed in movies and TV series. To which Stuart responsibly replies, Silent Hill 2? And Lake's response was, I suppose it is inevitable that players draw comparisons between the setups of the two games, but I'm confident that when players experience Alan Wake, they'll see that what's going on in there is something totally different than what's happening in Silent Hill. It's up to you to decide if you think Alan Wake is totally different from Silent Hill 2. And I'll sum up my feelings on the topic with this facial expression. I think Lake called Alan Wake a thriller because he is trying to cloak the game in the legitimacy of cinema by borrowing a genre marker from something that he perceives as a more legitimate genre and medium. And that isn't a bad strategy. Lake seems to have bought into the idea that horror is inherently a low-class, cheap genre, and honestly, a lot of other people feel the same way. And I think if somebody went into Alan Wake thinking it was going to be like a Silent Hill game, they would have been disappointed. Genres are inherently so broad that it's really easy to ascribe attributes to them that aren't fair or accurate, like this idea that horror is all blood and gore and jump scares. You don't ever have to have engaged with the genre to have a lot of preconceived notions about the content and the value of it. Even if you've never seen an opera or a porno, you probably know that one of those is considered high culture and the other low. And where does that knowledge come from? First-hand experience or stereotypes? And here we come to the crux of why genres are actually so important. All genres fit into a hierarchy of value and respectability. And because of that, all genres are loaded with implications. You know, implications. When you hear somebody say, I listen to everything but rap, they are signaling something about themselves and about the cultural context of that genre. There's been a lot of talk recently about the fact that Beyoncé put out a country music album. That discussion about genre is actually about race and politics and the perceived demographics of who makes and listens to country music. And Beyoncé knows she's allowed to make any kind of art she fucking wants. And not just as a creator, but also as a businesswoman. She knows that any music she makes, it will sell. Some creators love genres and love to abide by their tropes because it gives them a sense of structure. For other creators, that structure is more of a cage. The concept of genre is often accused of limiting artistic freedom and cutting off possibilities, all in the name of making art that's easier to classify, and therefore more marketable, and therefore more sellable. Whether you're embracing genre or rejecting it, I don't think one of those is inherently better or worse. Whatever you need to do to express yourself and make your art, do it. As an enlightened, postmodern, post-structural citizen, I take for granted that genres are flexible. The implications we adhere to them aren't innate, they reflect our individual and cultural values. But there was a time when genres were considered a natural taxonomy to which texts inherently belonged. They were God-given categories that we must slavishly adhere to, not man-made constructions that made it easier to sell pornography. And if that seems difficult to conceive of or hard to believe, then consider this. The word genre comes from the French word for gender, another human-made category that is often perceived of as innate. In his essay, The Law of Genre, Jacques Derrida even referred to gender as a biological genre, the human genre. It all tracks. Genders are largely arbitrary human categories, constantly shifting, so large they're essentially meaningless, and definitely belonging to a hierarchy of value. Plus, I can say mon genre préféré est l'horreur, and it works for both meanings. Derrida also said that as soon as the genre announces itself, one must respect a norm. One must not cross a line of demarcation. One must not risk impurity, anomaly, or monstrosity. He's speaking ironically, of course. People have always mixed and matched and deconstructed and fully abandoned their genres. You know that famous comedy Hamlet? Well, there's this hilarious bit where Polonius is introducing the acting troupe. He describes them as the best actors in the world for either tragedy, comedy, history, pastoral, pastoral comical, historical pastoral, tragical historical, tragical comical, historical pastoral, scenes indivisible, or poem unlimited. That's almost a patter song, and it's a joke about genre mixing that was as true 400 years ago as it is today. So, what do we do with things that don't fit? Easy! You double down on the existing categories, warp and mutilate anything that doesn't belong with legislation and threats, and never ever grow or evolve as a culture. Oops, I was talking about gender again. No, obviously you don't do that. That would be stupid. You just make new categories. It's not that hard. Calling Alan Wake a thriller was the first step in creating a whole new genre of video games, and it didn't work. And here's why. Most media will match a pre-existing group either perfectly or close enough that it'll just get lumped in. A very small portion of media will be so disconnected from genre markers that it won't be classifiable. A lot of academics that study genre, including Derrida, say that such a thing is impossible, that all texts must have a genre. But I think that's a form of confirmation bias. A genreless text is really hard to talk about and to market, so it doesn't get as much attention as things that slot neatly into place. And for a lot of artists, that's entirely the point. Become ungenreable. For a small subset of media, a new genre will be created in order to classify it. For that to happen, an object has to be sufficiently different enough and popular enough to warrant the creation of a new category. Weirdly, this behavior is hyper visible in video games because we so often use game titles as genres. Metroidvania is a portmanteau of Metroid and Castlevania. Roguelikes were named after the 1980 game Rogue, and for years, first-person shooters were called Doom clones. None of those namesakes were the first games to have their signature mechanics, but they did all popularize them, and in doing so inspired other devs to make similar games, so they became the touchstone for comparison. Most genres do not get named this way. It would be like if we called westerns stagecoach-alikes. 9 years ago, Souls-like basically didn't exist as a genre. As FromSoft games became more broadly popular, more devs started mimicking their designs to capitalize on that popularity. And eventually, this phenomenon became so widespread that the gaming community needed a shorthand term to describe it. Then it became an explicit marketing strategy: Pinocchio Souls-alike. Slapping like or alike at the end of a title is the gamer speedrun strat for defining a new genre. Like we do with the gate suffix for political scandals, the punk suffix for subcultures, and the mommy suffix for fictional women over 6 feet tall who could break you in half. It's very rare for somebody to define a new genre for their own piece of art, and even rarer for it to catch on. And you'll notice in the Alan Wake of Alan Wake's release, thriller has not become a video game genre. Alan Wake is a great game, but it didn't have any sufficiently unique mechanics or story structures to justify a new genre. And it didn't inspire a wave of knockoffs that wanted to define themselves as thrillers, or, Wake-likes. So thriller didn't catch on, and Alan Wake 2 was pretty firmly described as survival horror. Genres are useful, but they're also arbitrary. They can enable creativity as much as they stifle it. And a genre can't tell you if a piece of media is good, and it can't tell you whether you're going to like it. Even in genres that you otherwise hate, there will be a piece of media that you love. And if you allow genres to define your tastes, then you're never going to find that. Hey, I have a merch shop with DFTBA. Check out the incredible offerings at bit.ly/JennaMerch, all lowercase. I also have a podcast called Big Game Hunger, where me and a guest get 3 random prompts and have to make the big next game based on them. I've had on guests like Jacob Geller, Janet Varney, Jacob Andrews, Janet Garcia, and Jacob Burgess. Also some people whose names don't start with J, but they're less important. Also, I have a pitch for you. I think at minimum, we should be using 2 genre markers for video games, a style marker and a gameplay marker. So like Vampire Survivors is not a horror game, but it is a horror game, by which I mean the gameplay is not horror gameplay. You're very unlikely to be scared while playing it. But it is aesthetically a horror game. It uses common horror iconography, your mummies, your witches, your Draculas, just like Castlevania. And we could also introduce a third genre marker for the perspective of the camera, so like first person, third person, side scroller. I think gamers sort of do this already a little bit, but we could be way more intentional about it. A pixel platformer, a Pinocchio Souls-alike, a Bethesda-ass RPG. I just think it would be easier. It'd be a better way to communicate that information.